Look, you write that in 1962, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was one of the few who realized how much his country was struggling economically and socially. So he's basically annoyed that the US have nuclear missiles deployed a few hundred miles away in Turkey, and he comes up with a plan to, as he puts it, throw a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants, right?
Well, one of the consistent strands, one should never overdo parallels, but one of the parallels between what happened in Cuba in 1962 and what's happening in Ukraine today, so much of Russian behavior is driven by weakness, not strength, by a bitter consciousness, a bitter resentment. There's this terrific Russian sense of grievance, of victimhood, which drives a lot of their behavior. And in 1962, when Western intelligence was misreading Russia grievously, it really believed that the Russian economy might overtake the Western economies within the next generation, whereas in truth, the Russian economy was a basket case. So Khrushchev knew that the Soviet Union was in many ways on the ropes, and he wanted a grandstand play to beat his chest and show the West that the Soviet Union was a great power. And so he hit on this idea of installing missiles in Cuba. Now, one of the things that British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan said to Kennedy privately, very early on in the crisis, he said, well, of course, we're giving you total public support, but we've lived under the shadow in Britain of Soviet missiles for all these years. And he said, we can't see what legal or moral reason there is why the Cubans shouldn't choose to host Soviet missiles, just as Britain and Italy and Turkey had chosen to host American missiles. But nonetheless, it was always inevitable, and Khrushchev knew that it was inevitable, that the Americans would go bonkers when confronted with the spectacle of ballistic missiles 90 miles from their own shores. But there are all sorts of things about the crisis that were not very well understood then, not terribly well understood now. One of them is that it was overwhelmingly a political crisis because it was driven by American outrage rather than by any sort of strategic reality, because submarines with ballistic missiles were already becoming ubiquitous in the oceans of the world. So it didn't make Americans any more dangerous having the missiles in Cuba. But on the other hand, it seemed a mortal insult to the American people to have them there. Now, the great thing in that situation, and this is, I think, a terribly important parallel with today, is that there were a lot of people who wanted war in America at that time. The American chiefs of staff, the American military, they were absolutely convinced that they could go head to head with the Russians and win, which most of us would say was madness in the nuclear era. Well, thank goodness, there was one man, John F. Kennedy, who, although his reputation is a bit tarnished in modern times, especially in American eyes, because of his dealings with women, all I can say is that it seems to me that he established his claim to greatness by his behavior in the missile crisis, because he saw all the way through that at all costs there mustn't be war because of what it would involve.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's an awful lot to unpick there. Let's go back to Khrushchev then. So was his plan that basically the missiles should be well established on Cuba before the Americans even knew about them? Were they supposed to be sort of hidden for months?
This is what's so crazy. One's always amazed by just how crazy great powers can be. And in 1962, when Khrushchev proposed installing these missiles, his generals assured him that they could be concealed on the island from American reconnaissance under palm trees, these enormous missiles, because it's crazy to think that for a moment. But he was told, we can install the missiles during the summer, and then in November, you can go and make your big speech to the United Nations and tell the Americans they're there. Well, there is a sort of madness about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, look, when the Americans discover discover this plan, basically, so you've got JFK in the White House, who is obviously sort of has a feeling of shocked disbelief about the idea of nuclear war, but he's surrounded by generals who, as you say, are basically very much up for it, right?
Well, it was their first reaction was very well. First of all, there was the unanimous recommendation by the Joint Chiefs that they should bomb the missile sites in Cuba and then invade Cuba. They didn't know, American intelligence was so weak, they thought there were only 5,000 Russian personnel on Cuba, whereas in fact there were 43,000 with tactical nuclear weapons, as well as the ballistic missiles. So they make this recommendation, and at the White House table, the first day of the meetings, that they discuss how the Russians are likely to respond if the Americans invade. And somebody says, well, they'll take Berlin, which they could easily do. Berlin was then a Western enclave in the middle of communist East Germany. And Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, the president's brother, he says, well, what do we do then? And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, America's senior soldier, General Maxwell Taylor, he says, and remember, all this is on tape. We have the tapes of all these meetings, so we know exactly what was said. And Maxwell Taylor said, go to general war, I guess. And somebody said, you mean nuclear exchange? And Maxwell Taylor said, yeah, I guess so, if it's in the interests of ours. And at this point, the president said, and it was such an important remark, he said, whatever we do in the next few days, we must do everything in our power to avoid any sort of nuclear exchange, which would be the final failure. And I picked up on those words, the final failure. And John F. Kennedy understood, as a frightening number of others around the White House table did not understand, that nuclear exchange would mean almost certainly the end of the planet. And this was something that, amazingly, once Khrushchev came to his senses, he realized too. But the scary part was how many other people, both in the Kremlin and the White House, were not half as scared as they should have been about the possible consequences of where they were at.
Well, I mean, so it goes to underline not only the importance of there being grown-ups in the room, but the grown-ups being in charge of the room. Is it easy to reflect about whether other US presidents in history, and indeed other Russian leaders in history, would have set a similar tone? Or are we, in fact, quite fortunate that we had these two people in those positions at that point?
I've said in my book that one of the scary things about where we are now is I think Vladimir Putin is a less rational player and a more dangerous and unstable personality than was Khrushchev in '62. And under the communist system, although Khrushchev dominated the Kremlin, he had to answer to a presidium, which was meeting constantly. And the presidium had real power, and eventually, after all this, threw him out. Whereas Putin, we still know amazingly little of what's going on in the Kremlin. But as far as we can see, Putin is making all the decisions. And it is a very scary situation that you have this, whereas, thank God, in 1962, you did have these two men, Khrushchev and Kennedy, who understood that at all costs they must avoid nuclear war. Whereas the third party in this, and what I've tried to do in my book is to set this as to not just talk about the 13 days, but to set it in the wider context of the Cold War and of what Cuba was and what America was and what Russia was in those days, that Fidel Castro, the dictator of Cuba, the communist leader of Cuba, that Castro was the one man in this hole at the top of all this who was not afraid of nuclear war. And there was a terrible moment, a moment that frightened the life out of Khrushchev, when on what became the last day of the crisis, he suddenly received a letter from Castro saying that in the event of an American invasion, which they believed was imminent, that, of course, the only course for the Soviet Union was to launch a nuclear first strike against the United States. Khrushchev was terrified when he received this missive. He was already a frightened man. But then when he heard this, he said to the presidium at the meeting, he said, only somebody who has no understanding of what thermonuclear war is, or is blinded by revolutionary fervor, like Fidel Castro, could possibly use this sort of language. So it was the fact that there were all these very unstable, dangerous people out there that makes the conduct of Kennedy and Khrushchev see we have so much cause to be grateful for. And also, by my reckoning, less than half Kennedy's successors as president could have been counted on to make the same decisions as Kennedy did, to reject the advice of his military leaders. To name but one, LBJ, Kennedy's successor, I strongly suspect that LBJ, who was a very insecure man, who was always desperate to prove his own strength, I find it very easy to believe that JFK would have accepted the advice of his generals and admirals to invade Cuba with probably ghastly consequences.
The LBJ would have done.
Well, of course, we can only guess. This is counterfactual. But and some of the others, you've only got to go over in your own mind. the list of American presidents since Kennedy. So we can take nothing for granted. And I've said on the last page of my book that I think, I believe that what Putin has done in Ukraine is far less, well, it's not defensible at all, that whereas Khrushchev had a sort of case for installing the missiles in Cuba, Putin has no case at all for what he's done in Ukraine. But I think it seems to me essential. The motto for any national leaders in the nuclear age must be afraid.
Well, so what does this tell us about how the West today can best confront Putin without causing Armageddon in this sort of way? Because I mean, in many respects, we think of the Cuban Missile Crisis as being the world closest to war, but in many respects, that was an easier situation than the one we're in now. Nobody was yet at war, whereas now there is actual conflict. I mean, what are the lessons there?
You're absolutely right. Well, the first lesson is be afraid. Is realize the enormity of what you're. When I read some people saying, "Oh, we've got to call Putin's bluff. We've got to. There mustn't be any appeasement and so on." That the great American columnist Walter Lippmann wrote in 1961. He said, "You grown-up people can't use words like appeasement in the nuclear age. You can't talk in that language. We are living in an extraordinarily dangerous world." What Kennedy showed in '62 and what I'm happy to say I think the American administration are showing today is a mixture of resolution in their support for Ukraine, but at the same time, caution. Notice that in contrast to some of the, I think, very foolish rhetoric from some of Britain's leaders who said, "Oh, this war must go on until the last Russian is out of Crimea or Ukraine." That's not our call. That's something the Ukrainians and, frankly, in large measure, the United States are going to have to say. But it's this mixture of resolution and the Americans with these enormous arms shipments are displaying that, but also the caution that you just can't talk. When some very stupid people in Downing Street a few months ago were talking about the possibility of a generational victory over Russia, I just don't think you should use language like that. And you will not, I don't think we've seen it from the White House. And I think so far the White House has displayed the sort of wisdom that John F. Kennedy did, and pray God it continues. But you so rightly said, it's much more difficult when the war is going on. At the moment, if I were making a wild guess, I would say there's no more than a 10% chance that Putin will explode a nuclear device. But 10% is terrifyingly high when you're talking about this.
Well, look, it's my last question, and it's a slightly ridiculous hypothetical. But you've got the Cuban Missile Crisis, but instead of the leaders we had then, you've got Biden, Putin, and Truss, and the rest of the world's current leaders. Is the situation there better or is it worse?
Well, I think one of the stupidest proverbs that people sometimes dish out, "Cometh the hour, cometh the man." In the days when that proverb, it was always a man. Well, I'm afraid the ghastly truth is that very often you get great crises have to be dealt with by incredibly inadequate leadership. The real question, we have to cross our fingers and pray that the world can survive the appallingly low quality of leadership we're seeing in many countries this year. And something is going badly wrong with democracies, not just in Britain, but everywhere, when this appallingly low quality of people end up in charge.